I was never one to believe in ghosts or scary stories. But what I saw in the fall of 1972 changed my beliefs forever. I worked as a night watchman at an old cemetery in Illinois. My job was simple. I walked among the graves, checked the entrance gates, and made sure no one entered the grounds. But after a while, I noticed something strange. Every night, at exactly 2 a.m., a man would appear at the far end of the cemetery. He always wore the same clothes. A suit that looked like it had come out of the 1920s, leather shoes that gleamed in the moonlight, and an old hat that hid half of his face. But what worried me most was that he never said a word, never looked around. He would just sit by a grave and cry quietly. I watched him from a distance for several nights. At first, I thought that maybe he had lost a relative and came every night to pay his respects. But then I realized that he didn't change at all. Not in his behavior, not in his clothes, not in the way he cried. Every night, at the same time, in the same place, with the same sadness. I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I took out my flashlight and decided to go towards him. As I got closer, a strange cold surrounded me. My breathing became heavy as if I had entered a space that didn't belong to me. I could hear the man's crying more clearly. Deep, trembling, and full of sadness that seemed to have lasted for centuries. I shone the flashlight on his face, and at that moment my heart stopped beating. His face was not like that of an ordinary human being. Pale skin, eyes that seemed to stare into another world, and tears that flowed from his eyes, but never fell to the ground. He slowly raised his head and looked at me. His eyes were empty, black, empty, and devoid of any sign of life. My whole body froze. The flashlight fell from my hand and illuminated the ground. At that moment, the man slowly stood up, but his feet were not on the ground. He was suspended a few centimeters above the ground. I didn't scream. I just tried to take a few steps back. But before I could move, he disappeared right in front of my eyes. Suddenly, the cemetery fell into a deathly silence again. I couldn't sleep that night. The next day, out of curiosity, I decided to check the name on his tombstone. Jonathan Marks, 1897 to 1922. I did some research and found out that Jonathan Marks had been killed in a car accident 50 years ago. But what terrified me even more was that when I found an old photo of him, it was the same man I saw in the cemetery every night. How was that possible? He had been dead for years, but he still sat in the same spot by his grave every night and cried. After that night, I never went back to the cemetery. But still, some of the new guards say that in the dark of night, they hear a soft cry from among the cold graves. And if you listen closely, you might feel that something or someone is standing behind you in the darkness. I had always been a truck driver. Long nights on endless, lonely roads had become a part of my life. On a cold, dark autumn night in 1983, as I was driving away from Madrid on a lonely, remote road, I saw something I will never forget. A woman dressed in white was standing by the side of the road. She was alone in the middle of the night, in a place where no one except me passed, with her hand raised. Believe me, nothing seemed normal at that moment. There were no cars around, only silence and darkness. However, I braked and pulled over. I don't know why. Maybe because something in the middle of the night made me feel like I had to give her a ride. The woman, with her lifeless eyes and cold face, opened the door as soon as she approached and sat down. Her voice was more or less flat and emotionless when she said, "Be careful on this bend. I've had an accident here before." Something in his words made me suspicious. His gaze was cold and lifeless, but I said nothing. I just kept going. The sound of the engine revving in the silence of the night was the only sound. But just as we approached the dangerous bend, I felt like I had to brake. I knew I had to be careful. I braked. When I looked back at the woman, she wasn't there. My eyes widened. I just looked around and saw that there was nothing, no one on the side of the road. No woman, no nothing. It was as if she didn't exist at all. I told myself that maybe I was dreaming, maybe it was an illusion. But when I turned that bend and looked straight ahead, there was something that looked like a car that had crashed in the past, shining in the light of my truck. The next morning, I went to the police station and asked them to ask about the woman. But when they started investigating, they discovered that a woman had died in a car accident on the same road several years ago. I will never forget this incident. In the dead of night, when everything was silent and all I could hear was the sound of my truck's engine, the woman's voice still echoed in my ears. "Be careful on this bend." She couldn't warn me. She was no longer alive. That dark night, I still remember.